I don't expect you to believe me. Honestly, I wouldn't believe me either if I were in your shoes. But if you're reading this, really reading it, then there's a chance someone else will find the same as I did, and maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice before accepting it. I was broke. Not the kind of broke where you skip lunch and mooch off a friend for gas money. I'm talking rent over Dubai months, couch surfing, sleeping with a pocket knife under your pillow kind of broke. That's why, when I found the post buried in a forgotten Reddit thread titled, "Make $10,000 in one night, no catch," I didn't laugh. I clicked. The link redirected me to a plain black site with a single line of white text blinking slowly. Spend one night in room 371. $10,000 cash. Non-negotiable. You must be alone. No phones. No contact. No exits until dawn. There wasn't a sign-up form or even a contact button, just a phone number. I stared at it for maybe 10 minutes, the voice in my head bouncing between "this is insane" and "what if it's real?" I called. Someone answered on the first ring, and their voice was calm, almost too calm, measured, neutral, eerily polite. They gave me an address, told me to be there by 10 p.m. sharp, and warned me, once the door locks, there's no turning back. No refunds. No rescue. Do you still accept? I hesitated, then said yes. Because of course I did. I arrived at the building just before 10. It was on the outskirts of the city, an old private hospital converted into offices, although nothing in the structure suggested it had seen use this century. The windows were dark and crusted with decades of dust, and a heavy iron fence wrapped the property like a skeletal ribcage. The front door creaked open on its own as I approached, and the sound it made wasn't just wood on metal, it was heavier, wet almost, like the building exhaled a breath it had been holding too long. Inside, a man in a dark coat waited beside a cart with a black case on top. He didn't speak at first, just handed me a clipboard and a pen. The contract was barely a page long. No legalese. Just, I enter room 371 willingly. I accept payment upon survival. I do not hold the owners liable for damages of any kind, physical, psychological, or spiritual. I signed it. Of course I did. Then the man opened the case and handed me a flashlight and a body camera. For proof, he said. We'll know if you cheat. And don't bring anything else in, not even your phone. There's a clock in the room. If you make it until sunrise, the money's yours. I asked him how many people had tried this before me. He didn't answer, just handed me a brass key with the number 371 carved into it. His hand lingered on mine as I took it, and then he whispered something that I didn't fully understand until much later. If it starts to whisper to you, don't answer. The hallway to room 371 stretched longer than I expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed above my head, flickering with a rhythm that seemed to grow more irregular the closer I got. The carpet under my feet was dark red, faded in some places, stained in others. At door 371, the light above me popped. Just blink gone. I took a breath. The key trembled in my hand, or maybe that was me shaking. I told myself it was all theater, a prank for a YouTube video, some viral escape room experience designed to spook people. That was what I had convinced myself, anyway, until I opened the door. Inside, it was just a room. A bare wooden floor, four walls covered in beige wallpaper, a single twin-sized bed with white sheets, a dresser, a mirror, and an old grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, like the room had pressure. And then, right as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the unmistakable click of the lock. I spun around and pulled at the handle. Nothing. I hit the door. Nothing. Then I heard it. From somewhere deep within the walls, just the faintest sound, like breathing. And then, low and deliberate, a whisper scraped across the inside of my ear. We've been waiting. The clock in the corner of the room struck 12 with a dull, metallic chime that echoed far longer than it should have, as if the sound was bouncing around inside the walls, repeating itself endlessly through some unseen hallway behind the plaster. I stood there frozen, the breath in my lungs suddenly feeling too hot, too sharp, like the air itself had turned acidic. There was no digital clock, no windows, no glowing numbers to confirm the time, but I didn't need them. The atmosphere shifted the moment midnight arrived, as if something just beyond my vision had stirred awake, stretching its limbs in the dark corners of the room where the shadows refused to lift. The old grandfather clock seemed to exhale a faint wheeze with each swing of its pendulum, and for a brief second, I swore I saw the hands move backward, only to blink and see them aligned perfectly again. I turned in a slow circle, flashlight trembling in my grip. sweeping across the beige wallpaper that now looked more yellowed than I remembered, as though it had aged decades in a matter of minutes. That's when I saw it, scratches, faint and etched just above the headboard of the bed, almost like claw marks or frantic scribbles made by shaking fingers. They formed no words, just overlapping lines, dozens, maybe hundreds, all converging in one jagged mess like someone had tried to dig their way out through the wall with their bare hands. I backed away from the bed instinctively, only to bump into the dresser behind me, which let out a low creak even though I hadn't touched the drawers. I turned to it and noticed something I hadn't before, a thin, old flip phone lying flat on the surface. It hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. My first instinct was to pick it up, but something stopped me. The phone was open, and its tiny green-lit screen displayed a countdown timer. 5 hours and 57 minutes. The numbers were ticking down slowly, second by second, almost like a reverse stopwatch counting to some unknown event. I didn't know whether it had started when I entered the room or at the stroke of midnight, but it was clear that whatever was going to happen, it was coming at the end of that timer. I reached out cautiously and touched the phone, and the moment my fingers made contact with the cold plastic, the screen flickered, and a grainy, static-filled voice crackled through the speaker. At first, it was unintelligible, just noise, electronic sputtering, but then a single word came through, drawn out and distorted like it was underwater. Stay. That was all it said. But the tone behind it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Then came the whisper again, but this time, not in my head. It came from behind me, from the far corner of the room where the flashlight beam didn't quite reach. It was clearer now, as if whatever was speaking had gotten closer, its mouth nearly brushing against my ear. It said my name, not the way a stranger would say it, but the way someone from my childhood would, someone who had known me before I had grown cynical and desperate. I turned, slowly, breath caught in my throat, and swept the flashlight toward the sound. There was nothing there. But something was different. The mirror across the room, just above the dresser, was fogged over completely, like someone had just exhaled against it. I hadn't noticed the mirror earlier. And yet, there it was. I stepped toward it, cautiously, the flashlight beam trembling with my pulse. As I got closer, I saw handprints forming slowly in the condensation, small, pale, and definitely not mine, pressing from the inside. My own reflection was delayed by several seconds, mimicking my movements like a glitching video, and just as I turned to look behind me, checking to see if something, anything, was hiding there, the mirror finally caught up. Only it didn't show me anymore. It showed the room behind me, empty, except for the silhouette of someone standing right over my shoulder. I didn't scream. Not right away. It was like my body had locked itself in place, every muscle wound so tightly that even breathing felt dangerous, as if whatever I had just seen in the mirror could hear the air dragging through my lungs. I was staring at it. That reflection. That impossible silhouette behind me. And even though I couldn't make out its face, I knew on some deep, instinctual, ancestral level that if I turned around fast enough to catch it, I would never be able to leave that room alive. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there like a human-shaped shadow carved out of the air itself, and somehow, impossibly, it was watching me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. I couldn't explain how I knew that. I just felt it, like you can feel the heat of someone standing too close even before they speak. When I finally dared to turn, flashlight shaking in my grip so badly it looked like the beam was alive, there was, of course, nothing there. The room was empty. Or rather, it looked empty. But the feeling lingered. The pressure. The weight of another presence just barely out of reach, like something had been peeled away from reality for a few seconds, and then quickly stitched back together while no one was looking. I needed to get control of myself. That was the thought that looped in my head like a failing mantra. Get control, get control, get control. I took a step back, then another, slowly retreating from the mirror, careful not to take my eyes off it. The condensation had already begun to fade, the handprint slowly vanishing like the moment had never happened at all. But the scratches I'd noticed earlier, the ones above the bed, those were still there. I turned the flashlight toward them again, this time stepping closer with more intention, desperate to focus on anything else, even if it was just damaged wallpaper. And that's when I realized they weren't random. At least not all of them. Some were just wild slashes, sure, like someone had gone mad with fingernails or a dull blade. But buried among the chaos were what looked like letters. Faint, overlapping, and carved so lightly that I had to tilt the light just right to read them. The first line. Don't believe what it shows you. Below that, another. The mirror lies. And then, in a larger, deeper set of gouges near the floor, One final sentence. There's more than one of you now. I backed away so quickly I nearly tripped over the bed frame, the mattress groaning beneath the sudden shift in weight as if it were protesting my movement. But it was what happened next that pushed me over the edge. The flashlight flickered, not the kind of flicker you'd expect from a dying battery, but a stutter, a rapid flutter like something was trying to interfere with it. I smacked the handle against my palm, and it steadied. For a second. And then the light caught something in the far corner of the ceiling, something that hadn't been there before. A vent. Or maybe a crawl space. A square opening with a cover slightly ajar. And inside, something moved. I heard it. A dragging sound, like fingers across metal. Slow. Scraping. Then, something dropped out. Not an object, a photo. I jumped back as it landed face down on the floor. My heart hammered in my ears as I knelt and turned it over with trembling fingers. It was a Polaroid. Old, yellowed, and slightly warped by moisture. The image showed this room, from the same angle I had first seen it. Only the man in the picture wasn't me. He had my clothes, my hair, my face. But he was smiling at the camera with black eyes. And behind him, curled up on the bed like some grotesque puppet, was another version of me. Gaunt, gray, eyes wide open, mouth stretched in a scream that would never come out. The timestamp on the photo? Tomorrow's date. 5:57 a.m. The photo slipped from my fingers like it had burned me, landing silently on the wooden floorboards that were now starting to creak under my every step, as if the room had developed a pulse that throbbed beneath my feet. I staggered back, one hand covering my mouth, the other gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. There were no words in my mind, only the cold, sharp panic of realizing something I couldn't bring myself to fully process, that this wasn't just a haunted room or a psychological test, this was a trap. And it had been baiting me since the moment I stepped inside. My hand shook, and for a second, I thought I might cry, not out of fear exactly, but from the sudden, gut-wrenching sense that I'd just caught a glimpse of something I was never supposed to see, something that had already marked me. I picked the Polaroid up again and looked at the timestamp. 5:57 a.m. That was the same time on the countdown timer that had appeared on the flip phone earlier. I suddenly had the sickening realization that the timer wasn't counting down to something happening. It was counting down to someone replacing me. I turned sharply, scanning the room for any more signs that I'd missed. That's when I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, like static beneath the silence, a sort of rhythmic rustling that grew louder the more I tried to ignore it. The whispers had returned, but this time they weren't behind me, or above me, or even in the mirror. They were everywhere. Layers upon layers of disjointed voices, overlapping like broken recordings, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out until I held completely still. Then, slowly, I began to hear phrases bubble to the surface. It's watching you, and don't answer when it knocks, and we lied. There's no sunrise. I froze. Not just from fear, but from the terrifying suggestion that maybe this wasn't a one-night thing. Maybe no one had ever left the room, and maybe that voice on the phone, the one that gave me the address and handed me the contract, wasn't even a person. What if it was the room itself? What if it used voices like bait, just to keep people walking through the door voluntarily? As I stood there, absorbing that horrifying possibility, the light from my flashlight passed over something new, something that hadn't been there minutes before. A door frame. I blinked, then stepped closer. It wasn't just a crack in the wall or a warped illusion. It was a full door, a perfectly rectangular outline with a rusted handle, nestled directly between the dresser and the corner where the mirror hung. But here's the thing. I had already examined that part of the room earlier. There was nothing there. This door had appeared suddenly, quietly, like it had been waiting for the exact moment I would notice it. Against every ounce of survival instinct in my body, I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold, and for a split second, I saw my breath fog the air in front of me, something that shouldn't have happened in a room with no ventilation. I turned the knob slowly, praying it would be locked, hoping I wouldn't have to face whatever was behind it. It clicked. It opened. And on the other side wasn't a hallway, or another room, or even darkness. It was a perfect replica of the room I was already standing in. Identical in every way, furniture, mirror, bed, but darker, older. And on the floor, directly in the center of the room, was a body curled in the fetal position, shaking violently and whispering the same phrase over and over through bloody lips. Don't answer it. Don't answer it. Don't answer. Then something on the other side knocked. Once. Twice. 3 slow, deliberate knocks coming not from the hallway, not from the door, but from inside the walls. I didn't enter the second room, not fully. I stood in the doorway like a man pressed against the glass of his own coffin, staring at the curled, shivering body that wore a shirt identical to mine, his voice a broken record of panic that bled through the silence. He didn't look at me. He didn't seem to notice me at all. He just rocked slowly on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, blood crusted along the sides of his mouth, repeating the same fragmented warning like a dying machine. Don't answer it. Don't let it see you. Don't answer it. My body screamed at me to run, but the hallway behind me, the one I had come through just hours ago, was no longer there. Or if it was, the door had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the walls or erased by whatever rules this place operated under. I stepped back into the first room, shutting the new door carefully, as if slamming it might draw attention I couldn't afford. And that's when I noticed something else had changed. The scratches on the wall were moving. Not being written, shifting. The words I'd read earlier were fading, sliding, warping, forming new lines like something was editing them in real time. Where before it had warned me, now the gouged sentence read, "He already saw you." Below that, a second line was slowly forming, the carved letters pressing outward from the drywall itself, as though being written from the inside. "You can't leave until you bring another." I backed away from the wall, flashlight trembling, heart slamming against my ribs, and that's when the entire room shifted. I can't explain it properly, not in words that make sense. It wasn't like the floor moved or the ceiling cracked. It was more like the space itself folded, bending slightly at the edges, just enough to make the corners of the room feel longer, as though the geometry had become subtly wrong. The mirror across the room flickered, showing the second room's reflection instead of mine. The mattress let out a low creak, and I turned just in time to see the outline of a figure rise from the bed, a pale, sunken silhouette, its limbs twitching like it didn't know how to use them, head tilted too far to the side, eyes wide and unblinking. It looked like me, but it wasn't me. It stood there, lips stretched into a grin so wide it cracked the skin at the corners of its mouth, and then it collapsed suddenly limp, like a marionette with its strings cut. I rushed to the bed, but there was nothing there. The sheets were smooth, the pillow untouched, but the faint shape of a body remained pressed into the mattress, as if someone had been laying there for hours or years. That's when I started tearing through the dresser drawers, desperate to find anything that made sense, some object or record that might explain what the hell this room actually was. And that's when I found the journal. Hidden beneath the false bottom of the lowest drawer, wrapped in what looked like old surgical gauze, the leather-bound book crackled in my hands like it hadn't been touched in decades. The first page was filled with neat, cursive handwriting. It belonged to someone named Dr. Ellis Hart, head of what used to be the psychiatric wing of this building before it was condemned. I flipped through the entries, eyes scanning notes on experimental sensory deprivation, sleep control, soul displacement, whatever the hell that meant. And then I found a page with photos, black and white portraits of patients who had stayed in room 371 for overnight studies. All of them marked as deceased. But someone had crossed that word out in red ink and written, "Not deceased." Transferred. My blood ran cold. On the final page, dated years after the rest, Dr. Hart's writing had become erratic, spiraling, nearly illegible. But the last entry was burned into my memory the second I read it. The room doesn't kill. It consumes. It becomes. It remembers every soul it takes, and it's almost full. The journal slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. Then, behind me, the bed creaked again. The sound of the bed creaking behind me was like a scream whispered directly into my bones. It was soft, barely audible, but so deeply wrong that my entire body seized with instinctive terror. I didn't turn right away. I didn't want to see what had made that sound. But the room wanted me to. I could feel it, the pull of unseen eyes watching me not from one place, but from everywhere at once. The mirror hummed with static, though there was no electricity in the room, and the air around me suddenly grew colder, charged with something that tasted like rusted iron and old soil. I finally turned toward the bed, flashlight in hand, and what I saw almost broke me. The blanket had been pulled back, not by force, not violently, but neatly, with care, as if someone were preparing it for sleep. On the mattress, indented into the pale sheets, was the shape of a body, head on the pillow, knees slightly bent, hands folded across the chest, but the bed was empty. Completely empty. It was like the person was invisible but still there, the form pressing downward under the weight of something I couldn't see. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything, but my legs refused to obey, locked in place by some invisible thread of fear too ancient to name. And then the whispering began again, only this time it wasn't scattered or chaotic. It was a single voice, clear and sharp, like broken glass dragged over bare skin. It didn't echo from the walls or crawl from the floorboards. It came from inside my head, coiling around my thoughts like a parasite learning to mimic its host. He left pieces behind, it said. You can use them if you want to stay. I screamed at it to stop, out loud, my own voice sounding foreign in my ears, but the whisper only laughed. The mirror flickered. The furniture warped. And for one horrifying moment, the room blinked. Yes, blinked, like an eye forced closed and opened again in a burst of light. And when it did, I was no longer standing alone. Across from me stood myself, not a reflection, not an illusion, but a perfect replica, identical in every detail except for one thing. His eyes were completely black, smooth and wet and depthless like holes in the world. He smiled. I didn't. He tilted his head in a slow, jerking motion, and when he opened his mouth, I heard my voice, distorted, lower, filled with hunger, say, "You weren't the first. You won't be the last." I lunged toward him, but he didn't move. He just laughed, a dry, cracking sound like something trying to learn how to be human. I swung my flashlight, but the beam fractured in midair like it had hit glass, scattering into 1,000 points of light that hung motionless for a moment before melting into the walls. The fake me vanished, gone in a blink. I stumbled backward, breathing hard, and nearly tripped over the journal I dropped earlier. As I bent down to grab it, something on the page caught my eye, a new entry, fresh ink still glistening, my own name now written in the list of subjects recovered. That was when I knew the truth, or at least enough of it to want to claw at the walls and scream until my throat tore open. This room didn't haunt you. It studied you. It learned your shape, your voice, your thoughts, and it duplicated you, piece by piece, until it no longer needed the original. I staggered to my feet, dizzy with terror, and that's when I saw the worst thing yet. The countdown timer. The phone I had left on the dresser was now sitting on the floor by the door, its screen glowing bright in the dark. It no longer said 5 hours and 57 minutes. It now read 32 minutes and 16 seconds. The timer blinked silently from the floor like a cold, indifferent eye, and for a moment, I couldn't move, not from fear, but from the overwhelming awareness that whatever was going to happen when those last seconds vanished wasn't just bad. It was final. The kind of final that rewrites your name from a list of the living into something much less permanent. I snatched the phone up, but the screen immediately glitched, turning into static before displaying a completely different image, a live feed of the room. Only in this version, the lights were dimmer, the air was thicker, and the figure on the bed, the one I had seen before, was no longer curled up. It was standing now, facing the mirror, arms hanging limply at its sides. As I watched in horror, the figure slowly turned its head toward the camera, meeting my gaze through the screen, and smiled. At that exact moment, a cracking sound echoed behind me, loud and unnatural, like concrete being split open with a wet, meaty crunch. I turned. The wall behind the dresser was peeling itself apart, forming an arched hole where there had been only wallpaper seconds before. Beyond it was not just another room. It was a copy of this one, but darker, older. The same as the second room I had seen behind the mysterious door earlier, but now it looked alive, breathing, pulsing, as if the walls were made of flesh just beneath the paint. I stepped closer, drawn in by something I can only describe as magnetic dread, the kind of terror that doesn't scream at you to run, but whispers you're already part of this. The air beyond the broken wall was thick and humid, carrying the scent of rot, mold, and the faintest trace of burnt hair. I climbed through the opening. My skin crawled the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was denser, the sounds muted, and the light didn't behave like it should. It wavered like candle flames without any source, casting twitching shadows that danced on their own. The bed was there again, but it was in ruins, as if hundreds of bodies had passed through it and left behind pieces. And then I saw them, the others, not just the silhouette from the bed or the black-eyed version of myself, but all the others. Figures lined the far wall, dozens, maybe more, pressed into the wallpaper like photographs etched into flesh. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes wide open, their mouths sewn shut with strands of hair and something that looked like wire. They didn't move, but I could hear them, feel them, whispering in my mind. Not words, desperation, and something worse, resignation. One of them had the same scar I do on my right eyebrow. Another had the same chipped tooth I got from a bicycle crash when I was 10. They weren't just random souls. They were all me. I stumbled backward, trying to scream, but the sound caught in my throat like a stone, and my knees buckled. The room spun. Somewhere in the background, the mirror buzzed again, and I turned just in time to see the reflection shift. This time, it showed the original version of the room, my room, empty, door wide open, light pouring in from the hallway. An exit. I crawled toward the mirror, driven by a final surge of hope that maybe, somehow, I had broken the cycle. But just as I reached the glass, a hand shot out from the reflection and grabbed my wrist, my own hand. It yanked hard, pulling me halfway through the mirror, and I saw my duplicate on the other side, standing with calm precision, staring at me with a perfect imitation of my terror. He leaned close and whispered into my ear, through the barrier of glass and space and identity. One of us gets out. The room decides who. Then the reflection shattered. I fell backward, alone again, bleeding from dozens of tiny glass cuts that I couldn't remember getting. And behind me, the whispering of the trapped grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew what I now did. That the room was choosing. That it was almost done. I don't remember how long I sat there on the floor after the mirror shattered. Seconds, minutes, maybe longer, but I know something changed in the air, something subtle yet irreversible, like a final decision had just been made without my knowledge. The reflection was gone now, fractured into 100 pieces scattered around me, each shard flashing brief, impossible images when I dared to look. A woman sobbing under the bed, a child with no eyes crouching in the corner, a hand reaching out of the mattress like it was water. Every image bled into the next until I couldn't tell where my thoughts ended and the room's memories began. I crawled to the far wall, my fingers sticky with drying blood and sweat, and that's when I saw it. Something I hadn't noticed before. A section of wallpaper had curled upwards slightly near the floor, just enough to reveal a hidden compartment carved crudely into the wall. My fingers trembled as I pulled it open. Inside, wrapped in rotting cloth and sealed with wax, was another journal, but this one was older, darker, thicker, and unlike Dr. Hart's clean and clinical notes, this book felt angry, violent, like it didn't want to be read. Still, I opened it, because of course I did. Every page was covered in scrawled writing, some in English, some in languages I didn't recognize, and some that looked like they were written by dragging fingernails through blood. At the center of the book was a page that pulsed beneath my fingertips, and as I stared at the ink, no, not ink, something darker, something oily, it began to shift, to reshape itself into legible words. It read, "To escape, the door must open. To open the door, another must enter. The room does not release, it replaces." My stomach churned with a kind of moral sickness that went deeper than fear. It was offering me a way out. A loophole. A bargain. The phone vibrated in my pocket at that exact moment. Somehow it had returned to me, and a message lit up the screen. Choose wisely. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud, sharp and bitter, the kind of laugh that only comes when you realize you were never the main character in your own life. I stood up, the journal still open in one hand, and looked at the dresser. There, nestled where the journal had been, was something new. A disposable phone, powered on, with one contact already loaded in. A name I didn't recognize. A number I didn't know. But I understood the purpose. I was supposed to call. I was supposed to bring someone else here. The deal was as simple as it was monstrous. Pass the curse along, and you walk free. No one ever truly escapes the room. They just swap places. And with that knowledge, a sick realization hit me like a brick to the chest. Every story, every whisper I had read online or heard in passing, all those urban legends about that room, they weren't stories. They were recruitment tools. Trails of digital breadcrumbs left behind by those desperate enough to strike a deal. I looked at the timer again. 7 minutes and 41 seconds. Less than 8 minutes. And in that moment, the room shifted again. It gave me something. A name. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was suddenly in my mind, stitched into my thoughts like it had always been there. Someone from my life. Someone I trusted. And the worst part? They would come if I asked. They wouldn't question it. They wouldn't hesitate. I stared at the screen. My finger hovered over the call button. Behind me, the room waited. The whispers had gone silent now, because they knew what came next. It was up to me now to choose whether to leave or stay behind and become part of the room. I stood there for what felt like a lifetime, my finger hovering over the call button while the room pulsed quietly around me, its breath a low vibration through the walls, its silence far more terrifying than the whispers had ever been. The air felt electric, not in the way lightning does, but in the way a predator feels when it watches its prey hesitate. The name glowing on the screen was someone I hadn't thought about in years, an old friend, someone kind, someone who once gave me a place to stay when I was at my lowest. I could still hear their voice in my head, casual, trusting, laughing. And now, because of this place, because of this thing, I was being asked to trade their soul for my freedom like a coin in a machine. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt something warm underneath the wallpaper, pulsing, beating like a second heart. It was waiting. The room was alive, and it knew I wouldn't resist forever. The timer on the phone blinked again. 2 minutes and 59 seconds. Less than 3 minutes. I wanted to scream, to tear the phone apart, to destroy the book and the mirror and the walls. But none of it would matter. The room wasn't just a place, it was a system. A trap built on choices, and every part of it was designed to make you realize, far too late, that you never really had one. I dropped the phone. Not because I had made a noble decision, but because I physically couldn't hold it anymore. My hands were shaking so badly that it hit the floor and slid across the wooden boards, stopping just inches from the original door, the one I had entered through all those hours ago. Only now it wasn't a door. It was a window. A perfect rectangle of black glass that showed me walking down the hallway, back when I first arrived. I saw myself glance back over my shoulder before the door creaked open on its own. The feed wasn't distorted or old. It was live. I was watching a version of myself enter the room again. My mouth went dry. I stepped closer, and the scene changed. This time, I was standing outside the building, a black envelope in hand, the payment for surviving. Only I wasn't moving like myself. There was something off. Mechanical. Empty. My eyes in the reflection were wrong. I blinked, and the scene changed again. I was at a computer, typing out this story, telling you every moment of it like a confession. And then the screen zoomed in slowly, until the reflection in the monitor leaned forward and smiled at me. I stumbled back, and the glass shattered, spraying me with a sharp gust of cold wind that smelled like soil and decay. That's when I understood. The room wasn't offering escape. It was replacing me, cell by cell, thought by thought. If I didn't make the call, it would do it for me. It didn't need my permission, just my delay. The phone rang on its own. I didn't touch it. I swear to you, I didn't. But the call was already connecting. I dove for it, trying to end it, trying to rip the battery out, but the buttons were unresponsive, frozen, as if the device had stopped being a phone and become something else entirely. On the other end, a voice answered, groggy, familiar, kind. Hello. My throat locked up. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Then the voice spoke again. Hey, is that you? I didn't think I'd hear from you again. I finally found my voice, but all I could manage was a broken whisper. Don't come. Please. Whatever happens, don't come here. But the call didn't end. The voice on the other end laughed, confused. You okay, man? I got your message. I'm almost there. My heart sank. I never sent a message. The room did. The whispering returned, now rising like a chorus, celebrating. It had chosen. The floor began to split beneath me, opening into darkness, and as the last minute ticked away on the timer, I realized something truly horrific. I hadn't escaped. I hadn't refused the deal. I had simply taken too long. And that, just like everything else in this place, was enough. I woke up on the sidewalk. Not with a jolt, not in panic, but with a strange, creeping numbness, like I'd been poured back into my own skin after someone else had worn it. The sun was rising behind the building, soft and golden, like none of it had ever happened. I was outside the fence, my clothes stained with dust, splinters in my palms, glass in my hair. The street was empty. The city was quiet. In my lap sat a thick, sealed envelope, black, like oil-slick paper, stuffed with exactly $10,000 in old bills. There was no phone, no journal, no timer, no evidence. It was as if the room had never existed, like it had spit me out after deciding it had taken what it wanted. But when I stood and caught my reflection in a nearby car window, I didn't recognize the way my face moved. It smiled a half-second too late. It blinked slower than it should have. And behind my eyes was a stillness that didn't feel like mine. I tried to laugh, but it came out too flat, too perfect. The way a laugh might sound if someone had studied it, practiced it, rehearsed it. I should have run. I should have burned that envelope, vanished from the world, buried myself in anonymity. But I didn't. I went home. I turned on my computer. I started typing. Not because I wanted to warn people, That's what I told myself at first, but because some part of me needed to tell this story, needed it to be read, remembered, repeated. And now, you're reading it. Maybe you're alone. Maybe it's dark. Maybe you've heard of the room before, in passing, in whispers, in that one video you saw but can't find again. The one that disappeared. That's not an accident. It's how it spreads. You think you're hearing a story, but the room doesn't just trap people. It seeds itself. In minds. In memories. In stories. And the ones who survive, they always share it. Sometimes in words. Sometimes in whispers. And sometimes in stories that show up exactly when someone like you is most likely to believe them. Most likely to follow the trail. So now, ask yourself this. How sure are you that you've never seen that ad? That black and white offer on some obscure forum? That mysterious job with no catch? Maybe you've already clicked on it. Maybe it's already in your inbox. And if you're still here, still listening, still watching, maybe the room's watching you back. Maybe it's already chosen you. But don't worry. I heard it only ever takes one at a time. All I ask is that, when your time comes, when you're standing in that hallway outside room 371, fingers wrapped around that old brass key, you remember my voice. And maybe you'll hesitate. Or maybe you'll step inside like I did. Either way, if this story left you unsettled, confused, or just curious enough to wonder what you would do, then tell someone. Say something. Because the room remains. And it's always, always, waiting for the next knock.